So we are in the book of Esther. You can make your way there. We're continuing on in our study of Esther. Esther chapter 7. Like we've seen so many times before in the book of Esther, they really like dinner parties. So I don't know about you. This book has a lot of parties in there, a lot of get-togethers. And what is festive in the book, what we see quite a bit, is they love wine. I don't know about it, but it talks about wine quite a bit. So how can you have a party without a great glass of wine, right? That's what the king always seems to have. To such a degree that the narrative will break it down. I was reading it today, and I was like, this is so funny. It's like he left his wine glass there as he was in a fit of rage. I'm like, why do you have to tell us that? It's just so random. So anyway, but he really likes to drink. So that's I think what the point is. All right, we'll get to there. So it's Esther's kind of its. Yeah, you'll see. All right, I'll just tell you later. Okay, here it is. Esther 7. So the king and Haman went to Queen Esther's banquet. See, told you there's a party. And as they were drinking wine, there it is, on the second day, the king asked, Dear Esther, what is your petition? It will be given you. What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted. Then Queen Esther answered, If I have found favor with you, your majesty, and if I please you, grant me my life. This is my petition, and spare my people. This is my request. For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. If we had merely been sold as a male and female slaves, I have kept quiet because no such distress would justify disturbing the king. King Xerxes asked Queen Esther, Who is he? Who is he, the man who has dared to do such a thing? Esther said, An adversary and an enemy. This vile Haman. Then Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. The king got up in rage, left his wine, and went out into the palace garden. But Haman, realizing that the king had already decided his fate, stayed behind to beg Queen Esther for his life. Just as the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was reclining. The king exclaims, Will he even molest the queen while she is with me in the house? As soon as the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs attending the king, said, A pole reaching the height of 50 cubits stands by Haman's house. He had it set up for Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king. The king said, Impale him on it. So they impaled Haman on the pole he had set up for Mordecai. Then the king's fury subsided. That same day, King Xerxes gave Queen Esther the estate of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. And Mordecai came into the presence of the king, for Esther had told how he was related to her. The king took off his signet ring, which he had reclaimed from Haman, and presented it to Mordecai, and Esther appointed him over Haman's estate. So when I think about dinner parties, I don't think I've ever had an experience like this at a dinner party. We are there, somebody accuses somebody else. I've seen those before, but not to the degree of you're going to go and impale him on a stick that he's got out for all the city to see. So I remember, though, at dinner parties, working as an event videographer, I've been to a lot of weddings. So in my college days, I would go with a guy, Al Alvarez. We would go, and he hired me. And so every weekend, we'd go on Saturday nights, and we'd go like the Vinoy or the Don Cesar, Fort Harrison Hotel, and I'd videotape weddings. And this is going to sound really old. This is back when Super VHS was kind of cool. That's old. So. And then he got a mini DV camera. I remember that was like a highlight. Instead of like a little black and white screen, I had color. That was my experience. But I remember though at parties are normally a festive time. They're joyous. They're meant to be moments of celebration. But what we have here is this is the second party that Queen Esther banquet that she had invited two people. One was the king, and one was kind of the right-hand guy to the king, which is Haman. So at this party, what we see out here is the working out of choices that have been made earlier in the book. When those choices are being worked out, we see the culmination of these choices that people have made early on. We see the pain of pride, where those choices lead. And the last thing is something that we've constantly seen throughout the book, is the providence of God. The first thing is working out of our choices. One of the things that we know about the king is a very peculiar individual. We have seen, the story starts off with this incredible banquet. This banquet that the king had thrown was 3 years after all the rebellion had died out. He had conquered the land, 3 years of just making sure that nobody else was going to uprise him. He comes in, and then at this moment, he has this huge banquet. At this banquet, the king wanted to show off the beauty of his wife, Queen Vashti. She's like, I ain't coming to the party. I'm not going to come out there. He goes and tells the eunuchs, go bring her. She's like, no. And so then in a moment of rage, the king made a decision. Was recommended to him, hey, why don't you banish her, never see her face again, and instead what you should do, go find another queen that pleases you. So what we find out about this king, King Xerxes here, is that King Xerxes is one that's been driven by passion. I mean, even it says here in the narrative that he was filled with rage when he heard these decisions. This is a typical reaction that King Xerxes has. He's in parties. He then takes moments to reflect about the decisions that he makes. There's always these places of decision-making that seem to be really bad at a really bad time. So at this moment, one of the moments that Haman has come to King Xerxes, he says, here, I have a proposition for you. There's a bunch of people that are causing a rebellion in your kingdom. My recommendation is we just annihilate them. If you want, I'll give you a bunch of money that'll go into your treasury for the annihilation of all this group of people that will not pay you respect, dear king. King thinks about it, doesn't really care. Sure, if it's a rebellion, I trust you. Go ahead and make the decision. Haman says it's going to be done. They send letters throughout the whole kingdom, which this kingdom, the Medes and the Persians, they owned everything. So he's kind of the Pope of the world in that essence. So here he is. He sends out couriers out, and on a certain day, they're to wipe out all the Jewish people on the planet. Then what happens at the very end of it, it says Haman and the king just kicked back, had some wine, and all the city was in amazement. So what we find here is that in this story is a culmination of choices that were coming down the pike for Queen Esther. Mordecai, who we were introduced into in the story, Mordecai comes from the line of Kish, which happens to be the same line as King Saul. So you have Mordecai coming from the line of Saul as that descendant, and as he's there, he's in this foreign land, he's serving this foreign king, he will not pay Haman, who happens to be an enemy of Israel, he does not pay him any honor. And what we see early on is the development in the book of Esther is this. What will God do with his people? How will the most powerful people and their choices in the world affect God's people? What will happen? But Mordecai says, listen, I'm not going to bow down to Haman. I'm not going to pay the respect for him. And there's this motif being built up. God's people standing in the midst of exile, and how will God reconcile? How will God bring closure? How will God bring his people out of this? So what happens in the story is that Esther is being called on by Mordecai. What I need you to do, Esther, I need you to go before the king. She's like, listen, that's a really bad idea. If I go before the king, he doesn't raise the scepter, my head gets chopped off. But what we know about the king is, the king, his heart, he's in love with Esther. He has a tremendous amount of deep longing and affection for her. He is driven by his affection for her. So that when he sees her, he grants her a request. What would you want? I want to have a dinner banquet. He's like, I love banquets. Let's do this. They have a banquet. He goes, okay, now we're at the banquet. We got Haman's here. What do you want? You're going to have half of my kingdom. She's like, you know what I really want? I want to do this again tomorrow. He's like, I love banquets. Let's do it again tomorrow. They come back the next day. And so the scene is this. A series of powerful people, a series of choices based upon greed, based upon evil, based upon the affections of one's heart. You see at this moment all of these things happening. Esther was a Jewish girl who was an orphan. Her uncle, who happened to work at the Capitol building, took her in. And when the call went out to find a new queen, here's this orphan kid being brought in. She's being treated by these eunuchs at the moment. And as she is presented, she's chosen to be the queen. So what we see is how choices that powerful people have made have affected the fate and the reality of other people. And so when I thought about that, I think about the reality of how all of us independently are moved by our own affections, what we think about, what our heart longs for. And so the question is, you think about the complexity, all of us with our own heart, our own way of thinking, all the decisions that we're making. And the question is, what is God's response to even all of our decisions that we make? And so we find here in this moment, Esther is given an opportunity to speak up. She's given an opportunity to show to the king the reality that Haman had deceptively told the king, by not that he didn't identify this people as the Jewish people, but to show him how Haman's choices is going to lead to her destruction. So she presents a question to the king. King, are you more stuck up on your own decisions about your pride of looking like a fool by issuing a decree and undoing it, or is your affection for me as your wife greater? She's testing the loyalty of the king's heart. And this is in the backdrop of the story earlier of Queen Vashti, who the king, when he made the decree, I never want to see that woman ever again, it actually says the king was regretful for the decision he made it because he loved her. So now the king is at a crossroads. What will I do? How will the decision I make, how will it favor Haman and what he has asked for, the queen, and what will happen? So what we find out here is that there are a lot of choices, good and bad, working together in this story. So the king, as it says here, as the king is driven, verse 7, the king got up in rage, left his wine, and went out into the palace garden. But Haman, realizing that the king had already decided his fate, stayed behind to beg Queen Esther for his life. So the king was so caught up in the decision that he had to make, he just gets off with, which is what he typically would do, in a typical pattern of his heart, just goes off in rage and ponders, what do I do with this situation? And so, as the king thinks about it and as it comes back, what the narrative and what it's showing us here about this story with Haman is the pain of pride. You see, Haman, in the story, he had everything going for him. He was the second in command underneath the king. He had incredible wealth. He had incredible stature. The man was incredibly blessed. And so here he is, in the height of his pride. He builds a gallows, if you will, higher than anybody would ever build one, to make a point. I'm going after Mordecai. I'm going to go kill him. And my pride will not relent till I not only kill him, but all of his descendants. So the guy was essentially an egomaniac. He was narcissistic. All he cared about was his name in the kingdom. And it would not, and he said, it'll cost me, there will be no great cost that I would not give up to have this done. And so what we find here, as the queen says, listen, king, if you really love me, I don't know why you would issue a decree to kill me. And he's like, one more time? And then what she says here, when the king asks her, who is this man who dared to do such a thing? She says, an adversary and an enemy, this vile Haman. One of the things that the book of Esther is doing is this. Think about to whom it's written. It's written to a group of people that have had made tremendously bad decisions. Those decisions had led them in a place called exile. They're not in the land that God promised them. They're not with the people that God promised them. They're being dispersed out. And the hope is, God, we've made a lot of bad decisions in our life. Will you ever bring us back home? Will you ever bring us back into the land? And here, God, the enemy, is number 2 in the kingdom, and he's looking to wipe us out as a people. So when Esther goes through the pain of pride, what happens here in the story is really telling. It's God showing through people's decisions, their bad decisions, how his providence is over all of that. How is that? One of the things that the narrative will do constantly is talk about this idea of the lot falling, or the lot fell on this day. Haman was one that practiced in divination or astrology, and he would roll the dice. And what happens is, if you look here, there's a subtle note to the reader that picks up earlier on an early part of the story. It's this. Verse 8, just as the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, look at what it says. Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was reclining. This word falling here is the same word that's used for when Haman said the lot fell on a certain day to wipe out all the Jews. There's going to be a use of this word falling throughout the book. The first time it was used, it said this, and the lot fell in the 12th month, the month of Adar. The second time that the word fall is used, earlier in chapter 6, verse 16, Haman was embarrassed because Mordecai was a one that the king delighted in, and you can go read the story. And as he's being paraded around the city, Haman is ashamed that he's walking him throughout the city. And what it says is in verse 13, Haman comes home, he tells his wife, Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends everything that had happened to him. His advisors and his wife Zeresh said to him, since Mordecai, before whom your downfall has started, is of a Jewish origin, you cannot stand against him, or you will surely come to ruin. So what's happening here? The whole point of the story is Haman, the second most powerful man, making decisions to do evil against another group of people, had cast a lot through astrology, and the lot fell on this certain day. Also, Mordecai, as Haman parades himself through the capital, everybody bows to him. But who? Who would not fall? Mordecai. He wouldn't bend a knee to him. Then right before this scene happened, his wife says, listen, Mordecai will be to the downfall of you. And what he's doing is he's building off of this word to this. When you get down to this moment, in verse 8, as the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman did what? Was falling on the couch. Think of it. The person in power who demanded everybody to fall to him, he has now fallen to the Jewish person, the queen. He demanded Mordecai to fall to him. The story flips it. It says, you know who actually fell? It's actually Haman fell to this Jewish queen. So there's something that's happening, and you're starting to see a reversal in the story. Something large is happening through, even though this powerful man making these powerful decisions, who's looking to destroy this group of people, God is moving here in the story. The last thing we see here, this providence of God. How is God working through all of these decisions? How is he working through this pain of pride? How is he doing all this? God is showing the reader about how he will bring someone to plead for favor. Esther here, in the very beginning, she says a statement. Verse 3, then Queen Esther answered, if I have found favor with you, your majesty, and if it pleases you, grant me my life. This is my petition, and spare my people. This is my request. The last point here is this plea that Esther makes. Esther, when she is making a plea, in some way resembles how Moses made a plea for the people of Israel. So think about it. Here's Esther before the most powerful person. All of her people are set to be annihilated, herself included, her uncle Mordecai included. As she's there pondering all these things, what does she do? She says, I'd like to know, does your favor rest with me? And she is petitioning him as a king? Will you spare our people? In some way, this is kind of resembling the whole story of Israel. You see, every book of the Bible is building us up, is building up a storyline up to the story of what God is going to do, how he's going to bring his people back. The Bible is a unified story. I like this quote, is a unified story that leads us to Jesus. And in this unified story, God is working by asking to provide favor for Esther from this king who's not a really great king. He's an alcoholic. In a sense, he is controlled by wine. He is a rage. He's filled with anger and violence. You have someone here, how can this person give favor? The guy is just out of control. So how is God going to move through this? How is God going to work through this really difficult situation? The same way he works through all difficult situations. The same way he continually will work to show how the Bible is a unified story that leads us to Jesus. Let me just read to you from the book of Exodus, chapter 33. This same idea of petitioning one for favor for a group of people is not new to Esther. This is what Moses did in Exodus 33, starting in verse 12. Moses said to the Lord, "You have been telling me, lead these people, but you have not let me know whom you will send with me. You have said, I know you by name, and you have found favor with me. If you are pleased with me, teach me your way so I may know you and continue to find favor with you. Remember that this nation is your people." Exodus 33, verse 16. "How will anyone know that you are pleased with me and with your people unless you go with us? What else will distinguish me and your people from all the other people on the face of the earth?" So here's Moses' question. God, if your favor is on us, you have to lead us. And so what Esther does is she takes the heartbeat of what God has intended for his people to lead them. In this situation that Moses went through, he had just got the people out of Pharaoh's control. They're rebelling all over against him. They're worshiping a golden calf, and he's just a little bit beside himself. He's like, God, how will you do this? Your own people won't listen to you. And he goes, if I have found favor with you, verse 13, if you are pleased with me, teach me your ways so I may know you and continue to find favor with you. Remember that this nation is your people. God's promise to his people, he will complete. And the story of Esther is making that reality crystal clear. I mean, so if you're a Jew, you're in this time, you're thinking back, well, God, where are you at? An issue has been decreed that all of our people are going to be murdered. What are you doing? Are you really going to allow this decree by Haman and the king to go forth? My neighbor is filled with excitement about murdering us and my children. God, what are you going to do? And so you have one acting as an advocate. Somebody steps up and says, listen, King, do you find favor in me? Is there any pleasure of mine? The same thing that Moses asked God. Then let these people go. Release them. Reverse the curse that you put on them. And what you see in Esther is retelling the story of how God is rescuing his people in a different context, at a different time, at the same time that they rebelled constantly over and over and over and over. And how this builds up to the story of Christ. You know, Jesus, when he comes, they talk about him in different capacities. He comes as a king. Friend to us, a child is born. The government will be upon his shoulders. He'll be called God with us. We talked about that at Christmas. He will come as a prophet. He will come and he will speak the very words of God to the people. and then he will come as a priest. He will make atonement for their sin. And so the story of God intervening on a group of people that have rejected him time and time and time again, God is showing his faithfulness in this story. The same faithfulness that he had built out in the story of Exodus and how he's led them out, he will do it again. He's going to do it again. And he's doing this despite all the evil of the most powerful people of the world. If you think about it, Moses in his story, Moses went to Pharaoh, the most powerful person in the world. He's like, let these people go. He's like, I don't know which God you have. I don't really care. I'm not doing it. And he goes, well, here's the deal. Either you let my firstborn child go in Israel, or I'm going to take your firstborn child. And God takes him. God takes Pharaoh's child. And Pharaoh lets him go. And now we have the same story. God, if you have found favor with your people, even though they've rebelled against you, will you let them go? Will you find favor with them? And what do we see? We see through bad choices of our own. We see through pride of our own heart. We see through rebellion of our own life that God is going to make a way. He's going to make a way to provide for his people because they're his people. It's his nation. Now, what he allowed them, though, is to suffer from their consequences. God says, listen, and he'll use such strong language that he will call it prostituting yourself. He goes, if you want to prostitute yourself around, go have at it. But know this, I'm going to send you out so that I can bring you back in again. And this is going to be the consequence of your choice. But here's the deal. He doesn't control them. He's not mind melding, manipulating people. He's allowing King Xerxes to rock off with rage. He's allowing Haman to be the most prideful person, to demand such glory and honor to his name. He's allowing all these decisions to happen, and he goes, you know what I'm going to do, though, is I'm still going to rescue my people. And what he's showing is that he is sovereign even over our decisions, but he allows each and every one of us to make those decisions, and he holds us 100% responsible for them. He holds Haman responsible for his decisions. He holds the king responsible for his decisions. He holds Esther responsible for hers. But at the same time, he's working. So, as I finish up the idea of the book of Esther, as we continue to see the story and the last bit unfold, is that this moment will be such a large moment in the hearts of the people of seeing God intervene. They will remember the day, Purim, it's a holiday, and they celebrate it all the time because they remember all the good things that God has done. And kind of in finish is this. How will God demonstrate his favor? How has he done it with us? Is that he had sent a priest, a prophet, and a king. A king over us, a prophet to speak on God's behalf, and he came as a priest. You see, every year in Jerusalem is that they would have to make sacrifices to remember God's forgiveness of their sins. And so what Jesus does is perfectly offer himself for you and for me to show us that he deeply loves us and he cares for each and every one of us. He will allow you to walk in your pride and your rage and all the things that control you, your affections. But at the same time is, if you come to him, he'll forgive you in what the Bible would say is atone, or he will appease the wrath of God that concerns you. And what he'll do is he'll cover your sin and he will bring you into his people. And so we get to become part of the family of God. And so he's there with us. He's our advocate in our good decisions, but he's also in our bad decisions. He's there with us, does not leave us. And the beautiful thing about the story of Esther is reminding us about him as a priest and what he will do and what he will accomplish. And that he is over all these things. And it's something that we can hold on to, something that can encourage us when we make bad decisions, but also in our good decisions. When we think too highly of ourselves, realize, God, it's a gift from you. In those moments when in our pride, when we do that, we realize, hey, you know what? God, this isn't from you. And I'm going to confess that to you. And here's the deal. Because I'm part of your people, you will forgive me because you love me and you've called me towards your name. You've called me to represent you. So help us, God, to do that and to realize, God, you're over all things and I can trust you with whatever happens. So let's pray together. So, Lord God, we thank you for the reality of, Lord, you govern all decisions, but at the same time, you hold all people accountable for them. Lord, in the story of Esther, what you've done is you've protected your people, Lord, through a really bold move by this queen. And Lord, as she mirrors what it means to represent somebody else on your behalf, as she mirrors what it means to come on someone else's behalf, Lord, I pray that we would look at Jesus, and what the Bible points to is how you came on our behalf. Lord, when we were weak and powerless in our bad decisions, you came on our behalf and you forgave us. So God, I pray that you would strengthen us as a people of God. Lord, and as a people of God, we gather together to worship you. That's what we do at church. So Lord, as a people of God at church, God, we just pray our hearts would be full, that you would continue to speak to us. God, you'd forgive us for our pride. Lord, but at the same time is, Lord, that you would help us in our hearts to be full, knowing that we belong to a people. So thank you for this night. Thank you for this time together. In your name we pray. Amen.